Arya Stark stood at the bow of a battered trading ship as it glided across the waters of the narrow sea. Dusk had settled over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of bruised purple and gold. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks with the salt of the ocean breeze, and she raised a hand to shield her eyes from the glittering reflection of the setting sun. The crew moved around her with a certain deference, not because they recognized her as a noble or a high-born lady. Her leathers were simple, her boots worn, her cloak a drab shade of gray. They moved aside because of something else, the quiet yet determined look in her eyes that warned of hidden steel. She had grown since she first left Westeros. In Bravos, she had learned not to be Arya Stark, but to be no one. Then she had reclaimed her name, and with it, a responsibility. She carried it across an ocean and found her way back to herself, a battered tapestry of memory and purpose, each thread wound around the single unwavering desire: returning home. Yet the word home for so long had only been a memory of Winterfell, her mother's arms, her father's stern but loving gaze. Now, years later, the coast of the north called to her, a silent beckoning that pulsed through her blood. She could almost smell the pine forests and snowdrifts even while still out at sea. As the ship drifted closer to the eastern coast, she thought of Jon, Sansa, and Bran. Their images came to her in pieces. Sansa's red hair braided neatly, her careful voice that always felt both soothing and distant when they were children. Jon's laughter in the courtyard, a rare moment of joy amidst the tension of being an outsider in his own family. Bran's bright eyes, always curious, perched by a window in one of the castle's towers. They were scattered across the map now, each forging a destiny that neither she nor anyone else could have guessed. Her father had once told her that the pack survives when together, but she had left and wandered so far. Could she still claim her place among them? The salt spray stung her cheeks, and she felt something akin to tears prick her eyes. She let them come, the brief surge of emotion washing over her. The men nearby sensed the shift in her posture. One placed a hesitant hand on her arm as though to steady her. She shrugged off the contact with a nod that was neither grateful nor hostile, only resolute. The gesture spoke of self-reliance. She was nearly home now. She didn't need solace. When the ship finally moored, Arya slung her pack over her shoulder and disembarked with nimble steps onto the lonely dock. The men watched her go, some calling out subdued farewells. One offered her a final piece of advice: watch out for bandits on the King's Road. She glanced back only briefly and gave a wry half-smile. She had faced men trained by the faceless men of Bravos. Common bandits were hardly a concern. In the early morning gloom, she set off on the familiar road northward. The King's Road was quieter than she remembered. Its traffic diminished after the wars and the toll they had taken on the realm. She passed no wagons, saw no caravans. Instead, she found the occasional stray dog or starving farmer foraging in the woods. The air was cool, the nights colder, and she slept lightly beneath the canopy of trees. She hunted small game for her meals, making sure to leave no trace of her camp besides the ashes of a diminutive fire. Some nights, it rained softly, and she drew her cloak tight around her, watching the droplets glisten in the moonlight. Her thoughts drifted to names she had once whispered in the dark. Her kill list. Most were gone, dead either by her hand or by the chaotic swirl of events that had engulfed the Seven Kingdoms. Meryn Trant, Walder Frey, Peter Baelish, enemies undone by cunning or by fate. One name lingered, one that fate had spared: Cersei Lannister. Arya wondered if the Queen Regent turned Queen had survived the ensuing calamities. She had heard rumors that Daenerys Targaryen had brought dragons to the capital, that the city had burned, that the Iron Throne was melted. Yet the realm's stories were 1,001, each contradicting the other. Arya had discovered over time that truth in Westeros was a slippery thing. She no longer craved vengeance with the same searing urgency. She had grown beyond that. But if Cersei lived, Arya's sense of justice might yet stir. Winterfell rose in the distance many days later, a silhouette of gray stones stark against the fading afternoon sky. The banners that once hung along its walls were replaced by new ones. Bearing the direwolf of House Stark, she noted with a fierce surge of pride. The gates were guarded by men in dark cloaks, though their armor was mismatched, reflecting the patchwork nature of a realm recovering from war. She approached slowly, her face half hidden beneath her hood. When she reached the gate, the guards barred her path. One stepped forward, grizzled and gap-toothed, demanding to know her business. Arya raised her chin. There was a moment's hesitation as the guard peered at her, something in her stance or the shape of her face triggering recognition. "If you seek shelter," he said, uncertain, "we can provide it for a time." Arya lifted the hood back, her gaze unwavering. "I'm Arya Stark," she said. Her voice was calm and clear, shaped by years of training to disguise who she was. And yet, she claimed her identity now as surely as she would draw a sword. The name settled upon them like a hush in a September. The guard's eyes widened, and he bowed swiftly, a motion mirrored by the others. "My lady, we were told you might return, but go on, of course, go on." He hastened to open the gate, words tumbling out like a nervous stable boy. With that, Arya took her first steps back into the courtyard of her childhood home. Winterfell's courtyard was quieter than she remembered. Blacksmiths hammered steel on anvils, stable hands fed the horses, and a few servants scurried about. But the constant bustle of lords and ladies, the music that sometimes drifted from the great hall, these were absent. A hush lay over the place, as if the wounds of war were not yet healed. A pair of lit torches flanked the massive doors leading to the great hall. Arya's gaze swept across the courtyard, her memory layering images of the past upon the present. There, near the armory, was where Jon used to give her pointers on swordplay. Over by the well was where Sansa once teased her about needlework. Each corner was haunted by ghosts of her childhood. A distant shape emerged from the keep's entrance, and at first Arya's heart lurched. She thought it might be Jon. But it was Gendry, dressed in a dark leather doublet, strides confident as he crossed the courtyard. His hair, once unruly, was trimmed closer. A fresh scar curved along his jawline, and he wore a blacksmith's gloves tucked into his belt. He had come to Winterfell, apparently. The sight of him made her breath catch, though she couldn't have said why. Perhaps because their last meeting had been so charged with unspoken words and the knowledge of looming battles. She recalled the night they spent together before the Battle of Winterfell, the swirl of fear, desire, and the need to feel alive. Then she had walked away. Gendry paused when he saw her. His mouth opened, but no words came. It was as though the weight of all that happened settled between them in a single heartbeat. She almost smiled. Not quite. Her lips curved slightly, and that was enough to stir him into motion. "Arya?" he said, and her name clung to the air. She saw relief flood his features. He reached for her hand, then hesitated, uncertain of what was allowed. She extended it, letting him take it. In that gentle pressure, she felt the warmth of a familiar friend. "I heard you were here," she said simply, voice steady. Inside, she felt a tumult of memories. He nodded, exhaling as if he had been holding his breath since he first set foot in the courtyard. "I stayed," he said. "After everything, I didn't know where else to go. And Sansa said I could forge weapons here, help rebuild. There's plenty of metal to shape, plenty of swords to craft." Arya nodded, glancing toward the great hall. "I suppose Sansa is?" "She's inside," Gendry answered. He still clasped her hand, as though reluctant to let go. "Though she has meetings most afternoons. The North is restless. People are still trying to figure out how to move forward." Arya disengaged her hand gently and placed it at her side. She let her eyes linger on Gendry's face. He had changed, harder lines, a weight in his expression that spoke of carrying burdens. But there was also a steadiness there, a spark of hope she found surprisingly comforting. "I'll find her," she said, "after I've taken a moment." She walked away, ignoring the hush that had fallen upon the yard. Gendry watched her, but did not follow. She needed these moments to roam her home again, to let the stone walls and the memory of her father's voice guide her back to the girl she had once been. The corridors were lit with torches, and every so often she passed a servant who, upon noticing her, would bow or curtsy hastily. She reached the library. Dust motes drifted across the narrow sunlight, piercing the high windows, illuminating countless volumes that had survived the wars. She touched the spines absent-mindedly, recalling her father's library in happier times. After she gathered herself, she proceeded to the great hall. A pair of guards opened the doors for her, and she stepped inside. At the far end, upon a raised dais, sat Sansa Stark. Her gown was gray and white, the fur trimming around her shoulders reminiscent of their mother's style. She was speaking in low tones to a cluster of bannermen, their voices echoing off the high ceilings. Arya waited in the shadows, observing her sister as she navigated some dispute between two lords. Sansa's voice was clear, diplomatic, yet laced with an unmistakable authority. Gone was the timid girl who once dreamed of southern courts. In her place was the Lady of Winterfell, regal and precise. Finally, Sansa noticed Arya at the threshold. She excused the lords with a practiced wave of her hand and stood. A hush fell over the great hall, as it so often did whenever a Stark stepped into view. Their gazes met. The years melted away, replaced by a bond forged not by gentle sisterhood alone, but by shared tragedy and near destruction. Sansa descended the dais steps swiftly. She hesitated a moment, searching Arya's face, and then pulled her into an embrace. Arya stiffened briefly, then let herself lean into it. The closeness was strange, almost unfamiliar. She had become accustomed to the solitude of the road, to the reflex of vigilance. But here, at last, she allowed herself to feel like a sister again. Sansa's hair smelled of lilac oils and the faint trace of winter air. "You're home," Sansa said softly, her voice thick. "I didn't know if you'd ever—" "I'm here," Arya answered, a smile ghosting her lips. "I heard rumors about the North, about you, about how you helped defeat the dead and then fought for independence." She let her eyes sweep across the hall. "Winterfell stands strong." Sansa guided Arya toward the dais. She signaled for the guards to give them space. "There is so much to tell you," she said gently. "Jon, he's away on a diplomatic mission to the Vale. Bran is off south, researching something about the old magics. And," she paused, "but you, how did you come back?" Arya sat in a high-backed chair, ignoring the typical decorum of kneeling or standing in respect. Sansa, in turn, seemed relieved to drop the formal airs when alone with her sister. "I traveled from Bravos to the Riverlands, then up the King's Road," Arya said simply, as if it were no more remarkable than a casual stroll. "It was time, Sansa. I had to return." Sansa nodded, eyes glistening. They fell into quiet conversation about the fate of House Stark, the wars, the cost in lives. Arya learned that many of their former allies were scattered. House Mormont, for instance, nearly wiped out. House Karstark, mostly loyal again. And though winter had come, it was receding now, giving way to a fragile spring. Even so, resources were stretched thin, and the North was exhausted from war upon war. When they had spoken enough to quell the first wave of curiosity, Sansa placed a hand on Arya's arm. "There's someone I want you to speak with," she said. "Lord Gendry Baratheon. You already saw him." Arya smirked. "He's not exactly lordly in his manner, is he? Still the same blacksmith boy at heart." Sansa returned a fond smile. "He has a claim, Arya. After Robert's death and all the chaos, Queen Daenerys legitimized him. That makes him Lord of Storm's End, though the Stormlands are not what they once were." She studied Arya's expression. "We've been discussing alliances. The North can't stand alone forever, not after everything. And the Stormlands have their own rebuilding to do. Right now, it's just Gendry's men working the forges here. But there could be more if we formed a proper alliance." Arya felt something flicker inside her at the mention of alliances. In Westeros, alliances typically meant betrothals, treaties, marriages. She remembered the night before the Battle of Winterfell. The closeness she and Gendry had shared, how it had left them both shaken. He had asked her to be the Lady of Storm's End, and she had refused, for that was not who she was. But who was she now? Sansa must have read her thoughts in her eyes. "I won't push you," she said softly. Things have changed. The Lannisters... Well, the rumors say Cersei was killed when Daenerys sacked King's Landing. But the Lannister name carries weight still. There are pockets of loyalists. We can't have another war, Arya. We need to unify what's left. Arya considered her sister's words. Over the next few days, she observed Gendry from a distance. He had set up a makeshift forge near the armory, teaching a handful of apprentices. He handled the metal with ease, forging weapons that might never see battle if peace prevailed. Yet he wore the ring of a lord, a simple gold band with a stag engraved, and the cloth of gold cloak with the Baratheon sigil whenever formality demanded it. When he moved among the northern soldiers, there was no haughtiness. He joined them in the alehouse, drank from the same cups, listened to their stories. Arya admired his humility as much as his skill. She spoke with him in the quiet hours after the forges were banked. They walked along the battlements, the cold wind biting at their cheeks. He asked about her travels, about bravos, about the assassins who trained her. She offered him glimpses of her experiences, how each day was a lesson in survival and the shedding of identity, how it was also a lesson in becoming who she chose to be. He spoke of Storm's End, battered but still standing after the wars, and how he felt unworthy to bear the title of its lord. He told her that the southern lords watched him from a distance, uncertain whether to embrace or challenge his rule. But no one wanted another pitched conflict, not so soon after the wars that had ravaged the realm. The more they talked, the more she remembered the boy in the caravan cage, that proud bull's helmet he fashioned, the uncertain youth who learned he was Robert Baratheon's bastard. She recognized in him a thread of herself, someone always caught between worlds, forging a new identity by sheer will. She saw how tired he was, how lonely at times, and how duty weighed on him like a forge hammer. Something in her ached at that, a quiet empathy she did not often allow herself to feel. Sansa's subtle hints about an alliance through marriage grew less subtle over time. Arya avoided the subject at first, uncertain if the path she had chosen, no, the path that had chosen her, left room for such a bond. She was a wolf, wandering in the wilderness, comfortable with solitude. Yet she also felt something in Gendry's presence. A sense of home, a memory of shared survival, and perhaps a flicker of love. But was it enough for marriage? One evening, while Sansa and Gendry discussed plans to trade lumber from the Wolfswood in exchange for southern produce, Arya slipped out into the courtyard. She found her way to the old archery range. The target was still there, a tattered remnant. She remembered the day Jon had encouraged her to keep shooting arrows until she hit the center. One arrow after another until she did. She strung a bow that had been left by a guard and retrieved a quiver of arrows. Taking her stance, she drew back the string. The arrow flew, striking near the center with a satisfying thunk. She exhaled, drawing another arrow. Over and over, the motions came back to her like a muscle memory older than fear. She heard footsteps behind her. Gendry's voice echoed in the dim courtyard. "You still practice, I see." Arya loosed another arrow. Every day, she lowered the bow and turned. He had come up quietly, a habit from forging alliances in the north. He gave her a small smile. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the bow. She handed it over. He handled it awkwardly. Archery was never his forte. He notched an arrow, drew, and sent it wide. A sheepish grin touched his lips. "I'm better with a hammer." Arya let out a breath of amusement. "Yes, I remember." The courtyard torchlight played across their faces, revealing every guarded emotion. Gendry set the bow aside and stepped toward her. He wasn't wearing lordly attire tonight, just simple leathers. The wind rustled the fletching of the arrows lodged in the target behind them. For a long moment, they regarded each other. The quiet was a tapestry stretched between them, full of unspoken words. He swallowed. "Arya, Sansa's been well." She mentioned the possibility of... He trailed off, searching her expression for any sign of encouragement or dismissal. "You think it's a good idea?" she asked, head tilted, eyes shining with a mix of curiosity and caution. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. It might help unite the North with the Stormlands. My men trust your family because they fought beside them, but they still need a proper connection. And the North needs southern allies, especially after the winter. Food, trade routes, strength. Arya considered his words, turning them over. It was a practical argument, one that made sense in the politically tangled world of Westeros. Yet marriage was not something she had envisioned for herself, not even after that brief interlude of closeness. She studied his face. "Is that why you want it?" she asked softly. "Because it's good for alliances?" He looked down, jaw tightening. "No," he said, voice rough. "I want it because—" He paused, grappling with words that seemed to elude him. "Because when I think of the future, of doing my duty, of forging a new Storm's End that honors the best of House Baratheon and none of its worst, I see you. I see your strength, your skill, how you stand on your own. And a part of me wonders if we could do that together." His eyes flicked up, meeting hers. "But it has to be your choice. I know you're not the kind of person who wants to be caged or forced into a role you hate." Arya felt her cheeks warm. She glanced at the archery target, at the arrows quivering in the straw. Her mind raced with the many roads she had traveled and the countless roads she might still take. Once, she wanted to cross all the names off her list, sail west of Westeros, vanish into the horizon. Now, standing in Winterfell's courtyard, she felt that same horizon shifting. She tried to imagine being the Lady of Storm's End. The notion still felt strange, but she also imagined forging new paths with him, forging new lines of justice and leadership unlike any Westeros had seen. "I'll think about it," she whispered. He seemed relieved by her answer. He nodded, stepping back to give her space. She watched him go, the echo of his footsteps fading into the thick stones of the castle. For the rest of the night, she shot arrows until her fingers bled, seeking clarity in the hush of repetition. The next day, a raven arrived from the Riverlands, bringing grim news. Pockets of Lannister loyalists, aided by a few scattered mercenary bands, were raiding villages and hoisting the banner of the lion over abandoned keeps. Refugees were fleeing north, seeking shelter from the renewed threat. Arya listened as Sansa read the scroll in the Great Hall to the gathered lords and advisors. The news sparked immediate concern. The realm had barely recovered from the last war. The thought of Lannister stragglers rising again, especially if they had any hidden claim or the support of wealth from Casterly Rock, was enough to rattle the newly established peace. "How well armed are they?" asked a northern lord with a gruff voice. Sansa passed him the scroll. "Reports suggest they have the remnants of old Lannister armories. They're pushing a claim that a Lannister cousin survived and is rightful heir to the Westerlands. I don't have the details yet, only rumors." Gendry's voice rang out. "If they seize enough power, they could threaten both the North and the Stormlands. The Crown might be dealing with turmoil of its own. No help will come from King's Landing if they're still recovering." Arya felt an icy fury swirl within her. The name Lannister had haunted her life since the day her father was executed. She thought the lion's roar was at last silenced, but it seemed to be echoing back. She glanced at Sansa, who caught her gaze and gave a slight nod, acknowledging the anger that must be festering in Arya's heart. After the meeting concluded, the lords dispersed to muster troops or send out ravens for more information. Sansa, Gendry, and Arya remained behind, each lost in thought. Finally, Sansa spoke quietly. "We can't allow another war to ravage the North. We can't. But we need to be prepared if they bring the fight to our borders." Gendry rubbed his jaw, nodding. "Storm's End still has some loyal knights who survived the wars. If I call my banners, we can muster a force, maybe enough to bolster the North's defenses." Sansa looked at Arya. "And you? Will you ride out if needed?" Arya's reply was swift, her voice steel. "I will." She paused, then added, "I know how to handle Lannisters." That evening, in the privacy of her chambers, Arya examined her sword, Needle. It had survived countless trials, and although she possessed more lethal skills, Needle was her link to the past, to Jon's gift and her father's memory. She traced a hand over the slender blade and thought of the possibility of war. This time, it wouldn't be waged by the entire realm. It might be pockets of resistance, scattered but dangerous. Yet she knew how quickly a spark could become a wildfire, especially if the embers of Lannister ambition flared. She heard a soft knock at the door and opened it to find Gendry. He was still in his leathers, chest rising and falling with anxious breath. "You have a moment?" he asked. She stepped aside. He entered, looking around the chamber that was once her father's solar. It had been converted into a smaller suite. Arya had chosen it upon her return because it felt more private than the main Stark quarters. "About the Lannister threat," he began. "We should figure out what to do, how to coordinate." She nodded, leaning Needle against the table. "We coordinate with the Bannermen, the North and the Stormlands together. Maybe we can even reach out to the Vale or to Dorne, but that's more complicated. The Martells might not want to get involved." Gendry nodded in agreement, then lowered his voice. "Arya, there's something else. If these Lannister loyalists pose a real threat, Sansa will want a stable alliance to keep the North from standing alone. And the Lords of the Stormlands will expect me to do my duty, to secure my line. They might even push me to find a politically strong match." Arya exhaled slowly, understanding his meaning. A swirl of emotions coursed through her. Annoyance at the realm's endless politics, a flicker of possessiveness, and then acceptance that this was the reality. She studied him. "And you? Is that what you want?" He shook his head vehemently. "No, I want you. It's always been you, since we traveled north to face the dead. But I won't trap you. If you decide you want to sail away or keep living on your own terms." She silenced him by pressing a hand lightly to his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong through the leather. "I don't want to sail away," she said. "Not now. But I'm not a lady, Gendry. I'm never going to be one. Do you understand that?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I know. But I also know that doesn't matter to me." She considered the shadows dancing on the walls, the flicker of candlelight, the notion of forging an alliance, of uniting houses in name and purpose, of standing side by side to push back the Lannisters. It began to feel less like a trap and more like a calculated move that also aligned with her heart. At last, she nodded. "All right, let's do it, then." Gendry's eyes lit with relief, and for a moment, Arya was struck by how his presence was a comfort. The next few days were a whirlwind of hushed conversations, preparations for a formal announcement, and consultations with maesters on the terms of the marriage contract. The realm had changed enough that Sansa left much of the planning to Arya, trusting her sister's judgment. Maester Wolkan occasionally reminded them of ancient traditions, but they dismissed most of the pomp. Arya refused the notion of a large ceremony. She wanted it done swiftly and quietly, to avoid giving the Lannisters too much time to plot a countermove. As news spread, Winterfell's courtyard bustled. The northern lords trickled in, offering measured support. They had grown fond of Gendry in the months he spent forging new weapons, seeing in him something of Robert's open manner but without the drunken brashness. Stormland knights arrived, solemn men who had survived the wars and were eager to see the Baratheon line anchored at last. They pitched tents outside the walls, their banners snapping in the winter wind. On a crisp morning, with the sky a pale silver, Arya Stark and Gendry Baratheon stood in the Godswood before the Heart Tree. Red leaves fluttered in the breeze, and the carved face in the bark seemed to watch them with ancient eyes. Sansa stood nearby, a quiet witness, her hair pulled back in a simple style. A handful of northern lords formed a small circle around the couple. Maester Wolkan held a record book, prepared to document the union. No grand feast, no minstrels, just the hiss of wind and the distant murmur of the courtyard beyond the Godswood. Gendry wore black and gold, the stag of Baratheon emblazoned on his cloak. Arya wore plain gray leathers, accented by a fur mantle for warmth. She had insisted on wearing her sword belt. Needle hung at her side, a silent promise that she would remain who she was, marriage or not. She looked up at the face in the Heart Tree. Once, she had prayed here as a child with no real understanding of the old gods. Now she prayed for the strength to protect the people she cared about. When the words were spoken and the vows exchanged, her voice was steady, though a quiver of emotion stirred within her chest. Gendry's vows echoed across the hush, each syllable tinged with sincerity and perhaps a touch of awe that this was truly happening. They sealed the union in the northern custom, clasping hands before the heart tree and letting their joined hands rest against the bark. Sansa stepped forward to wrap a silver band around their wrists in place of the more ornate ribbons used in southern ceremonies. It was done. They parted, and the Watchers gave a subdued cheer. Some of the Stormland knights bowed, calling out, "Long live Lord and Lady Baratheon." But Arya turned to them with a small smirk. "Lady Baratheon, if you must," she said, voice tinged with humor. "But just Arya suits me fine." That night, a feast was held in the Great Hall, though it was modest by southern standards. Northern ale and mead flowed, large hearth fires crackled, and hearty stews were ladled into wooden bowls. The mingling of northern lords and Stormlanders formed an odd but amiable crowd. Gendry moved among them, laughing at crude jokes and listening carefully to talk of supply routes and fortifications. Arya floated at the edges, occasionally stopping to speak with old friends or men who had served House Stark for years. More than once, she caught Gendry's eye across the hall, and each time, they shared a fleeting, private smile. Sansa watched it all from the dais, a faint smile on her lips. She raised her cup in toast when the crowd grew raucous, her presence a calming force. Once the meal died down, the hall began to empty in favor of smaller gatherings or the comfort of bed. Arya lingered only briefly before slipping out. Gendry joined her in the corridor, where he offered his arm. She eyed him with mock skepticism, then took it. They walked in companionable silence toward the quiet wing of the keep. Through the windows, the night sky stretched, brilliant with stars. She thought she heard the faint howl of a wolf in the distance. Their chamber was simple, as Arya had insisted. A brazier glowed with warm coals, and a single table held a half-empty jug of wine. Gendry unfastened his cloak, draping it over a chair. His gaze found Arya's in the dim light. She felt a flutter in her stomach, a memory of that night before the Battle of Winterfell, when everything was uncertain, but the need for human connection was undeniable. Now, everything was different, yet also the same. They had chosen each other in a new world, tentative but resolute. She approached him, unhooking her sword belt and placing Needle on a stool. His eyes flicked to it, then back to her. He reached out slowly, as if worried she might vanish if he moved too quickly. She let him pull her close, and they stood there for a moment, foreheads touching in the quiet warmth. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the old shutters. She placed a hand against his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart. She looked up at him, her voice low. "I'm not going to be the kind of lady who sits by the hearth and embroiders." He smiled, bending his head to rest his cheek against her hair. "I'd be disappointed if you were." They kissed softly, the taste of wine lingering on their lips. It wasn't the desperate, uncertain act it had been that night before battle. This time, it held a promise of companionship, of forging a new future together. The flickering candlelight cast their shadows on the stone walls. In the ensuing days, word of the marriage spread across the north and into the southern realms. Some greeted it with relief, seeing a union that might stabilize tensions. Others snickered at the notion of a Stark woman, once rumored to be dead or vanished, now wed to a legitimized Baratheon bastard. Rumors swirled about Arya's time in Braavos, about the mysterious skills she was said to possess. But the whispered gossip did little to change the fact that House Stark and House Baratheon now had a united front. The matter of Lannister loyalists could not be ignored. Reports suggested a figure calling himself Daemon Lannister was leading raids, claiming to be a distant cousin of Tywin, with many Lannisters dead. Cersei, Jaime, Tywin, Kevin, and even the children, the name carried uncertain lineage. Yet mercenaries flocked to Daemon's banner, seeing a chance to loot and perhaps carve out power in the fractured realm. Storm's End was threatened from the west, and the north from its southern frontiers. Arya and Gendry held a council with Sansa and several key lords in Winterfell's war room. A large map of Westeros was spread across a wooden table. Stones marked known troop movements and strongholds. The lines of roads and rivers crisscrossed the territory that was now once again on the brink of conflict. Sansa placed a hand on the map, frowning. The River Lords are weakened. They lost many men in the war against the Night King and then again in the final push against the Mad Queen. They can't be expected to hold back these Lannister loyalists on their own. Gendry's brow furrowed. Storm's End is still rebuilding its walls and training new recruits. But if we leave them to fend for themselves entirely, Daemon's forces might sweep in. We have to defend the Stormlands if we're to keep them as allies. He looked at Arya. A two-pronged approach might be best. We can't let them unite in larger numbers. Arya studied the map, her finger tracing a path along the trident. What if we strike first? Send a contingent to cut them off before they can consolidate power. We can't allow them to reach Harrenhal or any other major fortress, or they'll have a defensible stronghold. Sansa nodded thoughtfully. We have some riders who know the terrain from the war. They could act as scouts. The problem is we don't know how many men Daemon has. Rumors range from a few hundred to thousands. Lord Serwyn, standing near the edge of the table, spoke up. Perhaps we should request assistance from the Vale? They remained largely unscathed by the last wars. Their knights are fresh. Gendry exchanged a glance with Arya. Jon is in the Vale right now, Arya reminded them. If he can secure their help, that might tip the balance. The plan began to form. Arya would lead a small band of skilled fighters, both northern men and some Stormland knights loyal to Gendry, down the King's Road to gather intelligence and harass Daemon's flanks. Gendry would ride south with reinforcements, ready to defend Storm's End if the loyalists swung that way. Meanwhile, Sansa would coordinate messages to Jon in the Vale, urging him to bring knights if possible. They hoped to contain this threat before it engulfed the land in another drawn-out war. When the time to depart arrived, Arya donned her traveling leathers again. She strapped Needle at her side and carried a dagger she had taken from Braavos, its blade slender and quick. A group of about 30 riders gathered in Winterfell's courtyard. Gendry stood with her as she inspected the men. Some were wiry and scarred veterans of the wars. Others were younger, with eyes shining at the chance to serve under someone who had fought the dead and lived. They murmured among themselves, curious about the new Lady Baratheon who chose to ride with them instead of waiting safely behind walls. Gendry placed a hand lightly on her arm, his expression sober. "Be careful," he said. "We'll meet again soon. I'll send ravens whenever possible." She gave him a confident nod. "You be careful, too. Storm's End still needs repairs. Stay behind those walls if it gets too dangerous." She said it with a teasing note, but the concern was genuine. He smirked, shaking his head. She didn't expect him to hide in a fortress, any more than she could stay idle. They were cut from the same cloth in that respect. Without further fanfare, Arya swung into the saddle of a dark bay horse. She spurred the horse forward, leading the 30 riders out of Winterfell, their cloaks snapping in the cold wind. Sansa and Gendry watched from the gate, the determination in their eyes a silent send-off. Riding south along the King's Road, Arya's band traveled light and swift. The landscape was still partially draped in the remnants of winter's chill, but here and there, signs of spring pushed through. Delicate buds on branches, the faint green of fresh grass. They passed scattered farmsteads. Occasionally, villagers peered from shuttered windows, wary of any armed company. The memory of war lingered heavy in their hearts. After several days, the riders encountered the first sign of trouble. A charred homestead at the edge of a small hamlet. Smoke still drifted from the ruins. Scavenger crows perched on fence posts watching warily. Arya signaled for the riders to stop. She dismounted and approached the smoldering remains. The air reeked of ash and death. She found footprints in the soot, evidence of horses, perhaps a dozen or more. Broken weapons littered the yard. One of her men spat on the ground. "Lannister loyalists, no doubt," he growled. "They set the place alight." Arya knelt, examining a discarded scrap of cloth. It bore the faint outline of a golden lion. Her jaw tightened. So it was true. Daemon Lannister's men were on the move. She stood and scanned the horizon. A few farmers hovered at the edge of the hamlet, trembling, unsure if this new band was friend or foe. Arya raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "We're not here to harm you," she called. "We serve the north." A nervous villager approached, an older woman clutching a young child's hand. "Are they gone?" she asked, voice trembling. Arya nodded. "We're tracking them. Did you see which way they went?" The woman nodded toward a hill in the distance, her eyes darting nervously. Arya thanked her and gave her what little provisions they could spare. Then, with a curt signal, she remounted and the company moved on. The next few days were filled with similar sights: burned farms, terrified villagers, scattered bodies. Fury simmered in Arya's veins. She knew war, had seen its ugly face, but the wanton destruction of innocents reignited a fierceness in her. They finally caught up to a rear guard of Daemon's men near the crossroads where the Riverlands met the approach to the Westerlands. It was a group of about 15 rough-looking mercenaries wearing bits of mismatched armor with lion sigils crudely painted on. Arya's scouts brought back word that they were camped in a small clearing by a shallow stream, growing lax in their watch. Arya decided to strike at dusk. Her band approached silently, horses left behind while they crept closer on foot. The mercenaries sat around a fire, laughing and exchanging jugs of ale. Arya signaled her men to spread out, encircling the clearing. With a shrill whistle, she sprang into action. Arrows whistled through the air, taking down 2 before the others had time to scramble for weapons. Arya darted forward, needle in hand. One mercenary lunged at her with a rusty axe. She sidestepped, her blade slipping between the plates of his armor. He fell with a grunt. The clearing erupted into chaos. Shouts and steel rang out. Arya moved through the fray like a darting shadow, each thrust of needle precise and deadly. She felt the old thrill of battle surge within her, tempered by experience. One man tried to run. She let him flee, preferring to take a single prisoner who surrendered moments later. Her men surrounded the last 2 mercenaries, who dropped their swords. Panting, Arya wiped blood from her blade and surveyed the aftermath. The company lost only 1 fighter in the skirmish. The mercenaries lay scattered, most dead, a few wounded. Arya knelt beside the prisoner, pressing needle's point lightly against his throat. "Where is Daemon Lannister?" she demanded. The man's face was slick with sweat. He glanced nervously at the bodies of his fallen comrades. He's marching on a keep by the river," the prisoner said, voice trembling. "Some old castle. We've been hitting the smaller villages on the way, gathering provisions. Then we were told to regroup near the old Tully lands." His words spilled out in terror. Arya's eyes narrowed. The Tully lands were once her mother's domain, though House Tully had been broken by war. "He's not heading west yet." The man shook his head. "Not yet. He wants to capture a fortress here, form a base, then gather more men before pushing on. I don't know the details, I swear." Arya held his gaze, searching for lies. Finally, she stood and nodded to her men. They hauled him away and bound his hands. She wiped needle and sheathed it. "We'll head to that keep by the river," she said to her band. "We can't let Daemon seize it." Moving swiftly, they mounted up again and set a course along the main road leading to the Riverlands. Each league they covered revealed more signs of Daemon's passage. Villages plundered, fields trampled, fear in every face they encountered. Arya realized with growing dread that Daemon was mustering a larger force, feeding on desperation, promising gold or loot to any Sellsword who joined him. This was not a minor uprising. It was blossoming into a genuine threat. When they finally reached the keep, a minor stronghold known as Stillwater Hold, they found smoke rising from its ramparts. Daemon's men had arrived first. The gates were battered, the walls showing signs of siege. By the time Arya's riders caught sight of it, Daemon's banner, a red lion on a black field, fluttered atop a tower. The men in her group muttered curses. Stillwater Hold had fallen quickly. Arya ordered them to scout the perimeter, hoping for a way to slip inside. If they could breach the keep from within and create havoc, they might disrupt Daemon's hold. But as night fell, she realized the outer walls were well guarded. Archers patrolled the ramparts. The gates, though damaged, were reinforced from inside. Any frontal assault would cost too many lives. She weighed the odds. They had only 30 men, exhausted from days of riding. Retreat seemed prudent, but the knowledge that each day Daemon might grow stronger gnawed at her. She sent riders back north to warn Sansa and Gendry, to call for reinforcements. The rest set up a hidden camp in a cluster of trees overlooking the keep. There, they kept watch, counting the comings and goings. Nearly 100 men swarmed the fortress, many of them mercenaries. They had begun fortifying its defenses, likely preparing to hold out until more of Daemon's forces arrived. Arya could do little but wait, the frustration eating at her. She scouted each night, moving close to the walls, evading patrols with the stealth she learned in Bravos. She was searching for a weakness, a sally port, a collapsed section of wall. On the third night, she found something. A partially blocked postern gate hidden at the east side, near the river. The water lapped at the stones, concealing what might be a thin gap that a skilled climber could slip through. She debated with her men at dawn. "If I can get in quietly," she said, "I can open the gate or cause enough chaos to let you in." One of her older men, scruffy and seasoned, objected. "Too dangerous, my lady. There could be archers inside. You'll be alone." Arya's gaze hardened. "I've been alone in worse places." She understood the risk, but also the advantage of infiltration. In her time as a faceless man initiate, she had learned that a single blade in the right place could undo an entire fortress. If she could eliminate Daemon, the loyalists might scatter. That night, she set out under the cover of darkness. She dressed in black, braided her hair tight, and carried only needle and her dagger. She made her way to the eastern side of the keep, crouching behind a rock as she observed the guards on the walls. Their torches flickered, revealing shifting silhouettes. She counted the intervals of their patrol and slipped forward. The river's rush muffled her movements. She found the narrow section of collapsed stone near the postern gate. Water spilled through, but the gap opened to a dark corridor inside. Taking a measured breath, she pressed herself through the crevice. Icy water rose up to her thighs, numbing her limbs. She gritted her teeth to keep from gasping at the cold. On the other side, she found herself in a damp hallway. The stone floor was slick with moss and water. She crept forward, straining to hear footsteps. Distantly, she caught the sound of men talking, the clang of metal, maybe from the keep's main courtyard. She moved deeper, hugging the shadows. This was familiar territory, stealth, infiltration, turning the environment into an advantage. She reminded herself that she was no longer no one. She was Arya Stark, but the skills she learned in Bravos were still hers to wield. Her progress took her through winding corridors. At one point, she heard boots echoing, and she pressed herself into an alcove, heart pounding. 2 mercenaries passed by, weapons slung lazily. They joked about the loot they'd taken from the villages, sneering in the darkness. Arya's blood boiled, but she let them go. A foolish kill might raise an alarm. Eventually, she emerged into a small courtyard. Moonlight revealed the battered interior of Stillwater Hold. Bodies of the original defenders lay stacked against a wall. Her stomach tightened at the sight. The keep was in ruin, but Daemon's men walked with an air of triumph. She kept low, scanning for a route to the main hall or the tower. If Daemon Lannister was here, he'd likely quarter himself in the Lord's chambers above. Crossing the courtyard undetected was a challenge. She waited until the guards changed shifts, using that momentary confusion to dash behind a toppled wagon. Her heart hammered, adrenaline coursing through her veins. In the quiet of her mind, she thought of her father, her family, Gendry. She could not fail. She slipped through a door leading to an inner stairwell. Torchlight flickered, revealing more bloodstains on the walls. Step by careful step, she climbed, pausing to listen at each landing. Muffled voices drifted from the upper floors. Finally, she heard a man speaking in an imperious tone, referencing strategy and the reinforcement of the gates. Creeping along the corridor, she peered around a corner. A large chamber's door stood ajar, light spilling out. She saw a tall man with golden hair leaning over a table, a map spread out before him. Daemon Lannister, presumably. Beside him stood several rough mercenaries. Arya's fists clenched. If she could eliminate Daemon, the loyalists might fall into disarray. But there were 4 men in the room. She had to be precise. She slipped closer, hugging the wall. She could hear Daemon's voice clearly. "We'll wait for my men from the west to join us. Then we march on Riverrun or Harrenhal, whichever is weaker. The North and their precious Starks won't know what hit them." Arya felt a jolt of anger. The Starks had been under Lannister threat for too long. She inched forward, mindful that one false step on the stone could echo. She clutched her dagger. The plan formed in her mind: eliminate Daemon first, then handle the others. If luck was on her side, the shock would give her an opening to escape. At that moment, one of the mercenaries turned, and his eyes flicked toward the doorway. Arya froze, pressed against the wall. For an excruciating moment, he stared into the darkness. Then Daemon said something that reclaimed his attention, and he turned away. Arya exhaled silently, easing forward. In a fluid motion, she stepped into the doorway. Daemon stood with his back half-turned, pointing to a spot on the map. Arya hurled her dagger, aiming for his neck. But one of the mercenaries shifted unexpectedly, and the dagger sliced across Daemon's shoulder instead of burying itself in his throat. He let out a startled cry, staggering. The mercenary spun, eyes wide in disbelief at the sight of a young woman in black leathers with a blade in hand. Chaos erupted. Arya lunged, needle flashing. The first mercenary swung a sword at her, which she parried with deft precision. Her riposte caught him in the side, and he dropped with a grunt. The second mercenary roared, lunging forward. She danced to the side, slicing a shallow cut across his arm. Daemon, bleeding and enraged, tried to grab a sword. Arya kicked the table, sending the map scattering, and flung her weight into the mercenary's side, momentarily pinning him. She was a whirl of movement, adrenaline fueling her. But she was outnumbered. Daemon, though injured, was no slouch. He slashed wildly, forcing Arya to dodge, losing ground as the third mercenary circled behind her. She felt a fierce pain slice across her upper arm as one blade found a mark. Gritting her teeth, she twisted, driving needle into the man's thigh. He howled, collapsing. Daemon bellowed for reinforcements, his voice echoing in the corridor. Arya realized she needed to finish this now or be overwhelmed. She feinted toward Daemon, then pivoted, driving a quick thrust at his torso. He parried, but his wound slowed him. She pressed the advantage, aiming for a killing blow. Yet he managed to sidestep, and her blade clashed against stone. Outside, shouts grew louder as reinforcements raced to the chamber. Daemon struck out with savage desperation. She ducked, the wind of his blade whistling past her ear. She felt a flash of fear. If she couldn't kill him here, his men would swarm. She caught a glimpse of an open window behind him. An escape route, possibly. Yet if she fled, Daemon lived. She feinted left, then swerved right, driving needle toward his chest. Her foot caught on the edge of the table, and for a heartbeat, she lost her balance. Daemon seized the moment, smashing his pommel into her side. Pain flared and she stumbled. The sound of boots thundered down the corridor. She could already see shadows at the doorway. Daemon grinned, blood dripping from his wounded shoulder. "Stark bitch," he hissed, raising his sword for a final blow. Arya dropped to one knee, letting his momentum carry him forward. She thrust upward with needle, the blade finding a gap beneath his breastplate. Daemon's grin vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed gasp as steel slid into his flesh. She yanked the blade free, blood spurting. He collapsed, sword clattering. A rush of satisfaction flooded her, but there was no time to savor it. Men burst into the chamber. Arya darted for the open window, ignoring the agony in her arm and ribs. She grabbed the ledge, hoisting herself over. Torchlight illuminated the stone wall below. She spotted a narrow ledge about 10 feet down. With no other choice, she released her grip. She landed hard on the ledge, nearly losing her footing. Another drop loomed beneath, leading to a small courtyard. She heard shouts from above, crossbow bolts whizzing past. She prayed to the old gods and let herself drop. She hit the ground with a painful jolt, rolling to absorb the impact. Gasping, she forced herself up, ignoring the burn in her muscles. Alarms blared. She sprinted for the postern gate corridor, weaving between crates and toppled debris. Mercenaries rushed in from all sides, but in the darkness, she remained a harder target to pin down. She lashed out with needle when cornered, leaving men cursing in her wake. At last, she slipped through the corridor leading to the river. She squeezed through the crevice, plunging into the frigid water. Torches flickered on the walls behind her. Shouts of anger and confusion echoed. She swam under the partial moonlight until she reached the riverbank, coughing and sputtering. Her men rushed up, some splashing into the shallows to pull her out. She collapsed, shivering and soaked. One or two exhaled in relief at her return. Others looked grim. They expected more. But Arya clutched her side, blinking water from her eyes, and said through ragged breaths, "Daemon is dead." Murmurs of shock and muted triumph rippled through the group. Their leader, the one who had cautioned her against going in alone, knelt beside her. "You did it, my lady?" She nodded weakly, pressing a hand to the slash on her upper arm. The pain was blinding, but the adrenaline still pulsed. "They'll be in chaos now, but we need to go." She struggled to stand. "His men. They'll come for revenge." No one argued. They scrambled back to their horses, helping Arya mount despite her wounds. She gritted her teeth, swallowing a cry of pain as she settled into the saddle. Then they rode away from Stillwater Hold in the dead of night, the bitter wind lashing at them. Behind them, horns sounded and fires flickered, but Daemon Lannister was no more. They carried the hope that his death might crush the Loyalists' ambitions. Days later, Arya and her men arrived at a rendezvous camp near the border of the Riverlands and the north. Reinforcements from Winterfell and Storm's End had gathered, brought by Gendry and a trusted northern captain. Arya almost toppled from her horse, pale with blood loss and exhaustion. Gendry rushed to her side, his eyes wide with concern. She let him help her down, leaning into his arms, her breath shallow. "He's gone," she murmured through cracked lips. "Daemon, he won't threaten us again." Relief flooded Gendry's face. He called for the maester. Over the next days, Arya's wound was tended with poultices and bandages. Gendry hardly left her side, pacing the tent, occasionally stepping out to meet with the captains. Word spread quickly of Daemon's death. Many of his mercenaries deserted, lacking the leadership and gold promised. The threat did not vanish overnight, but it was dealt a mortal blow. When Arya was well enough to travel, she and Gendry led the reunited forces in mopping up stragglers. Pocket by pocket, the Loyalists were disarmed or driven off. Some scattered to the winds, others bent the knee. Over the next month, the situation stabilized. The Riverlords emerged from hiding, forging new treaties with House Stark and House Baratheon to ensure no resurgence. Though fighting flared in small skirmishes, no new leader rose to replace Daemon. Finally, Arya and Gendry returned to Winterfell, greeted by cheers from the weary populace. Sansa stood on the battlements, the wind blowing her hair around her face. As Arya dismounted, Sansa descended to embrace her, ignoring the grime and sweat of the road. Gendry moved off to speak with some Stormland knights, making arrangements for them to return south. He caught Arya's gaze, a look passing between them that spoke of shared gratitude and a desire to rest. Inside the keep, sitting by a crackling fire, Arya removed her bandage. The wound had begun to scar. She traced it with her fingertips, remembering the moment Daemon nearly ended her life. If she had faltered, all of this might have fallen apart. Sansa's voice broke through her reverie. This union between House Stark and House Baratheon, nobody's laughing at it now, Sansa said with a small smirk. Word from the south is that the new king on the Iron Throne, whoever that ends up being, will recognize our alliance as legitimate. They can't ignore our combined strength. Arya shrugged, flexing her arm. We did what we had to do. Sansa studied her, a gentle fondness in her eyes. And how do you feel about being Lady Baratheon now? Arya's lips quirked into a half-smile. She remembered how she once scorned the idea of being anyone's lady. But she had chosen this path, not for titles or gowns, but for the chance to protect what she loved and build something better. It's strange, she admitted, but I'm still me, and Gendry respects that. Sansa nodded, relief evident in her posture. Good, then we'll rebuild. The north is healing, the Stormlands are stabilizing. The Lannisters are broken once more. Arya leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes briefly. I never thought I'd marry, she said half to herself. But it feels right. I don't know if I'll ever have a taste for feasts and dances, but forging a future, that I can do. Sansa laughed softly, leaning down to press a kiss to Arya's cheek. I'm just glad you're alive, sister. The rest can be sorted out in time. Later that night, Arya walked the battlements alone, the moonlight painting the courtyard in silver. She recalled a conversation from years ago with the Faceless Men. How to be no one was to have no ties, no identity. She had rejected that in the end, choosing to be Arya Stark. Now, she was Arya Stark and a Baratheon by marriage, forging a unity that might reshape the realm. She listened to the distant howl of a lone wolf. The night air smelled of pine and the lingering cold. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she saw Gendry, who smiled at her gently. Couldn't sleep? He asked. She shook her head. Too much on my mind. He slipped his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. Together, they gazed out at the starlit horizon. Peace was never certain, not in Westeros. But for the moment they had it, a fragile lull after triumph and loss. Gendry's warmth by her side felt like an anchor, a reminder that she needn't face the darkness alone. They stood like that for a long while, two survivors who had carved their own paths through a land scarred by war, united by choice, by respect, by a love that didn't fit neatly into old songs of knights and maidens. Perhaps the old songs were dead. Anyway, this was a new age requiring new songs, songs of a wolf and a stag, forging a claim not just to thrones and lands, but to a better future. If the Lannisters rose again, they would find themselves facing a bond as unyielding as the northern snows and as fierce as a Baratheon's hammer. In that quiet moment, Arya Stark, Lady Baratheon, if one insisted, found a measure of contentment. She remembered the faces of her lost ones and felt the swirl of the winds on her cheeks. She was home in the north, and yet her journey was not over. It was never truly over. But now she wouldn't walk it alone. And if the Lannisters or any foe came again, they would discover that the wolf and the stag together could unleash a storm that no lion's roar could silence.